I recently finished a playthrough of Fire Emblem Fates Revelations for the channel, and one of the things that came up several times is that I am higher than the general Fire Emblem fan on Revelations. In my 1K sub special, I ranked it above Fire Emblem 12, Fire Emblem 2, Fire Emblem 3, Fire Emblem Awakening, Fire Emblem 4, Fire Emblem Birthright, Fire Emblem 7, and Fire Emblem 1, as well as several spin-offs. And honestly, revisiting it, I would probably rank it even higher today than I did back then. That's not to say that I think it's a perfect game. I certainly have my share of issues with a lot of aspects of Revelation, but I do think that it is somewhat unfairly maligned. When people talk about the Fates trilogy, it's often framed as Conquest is the good one, Birthright is the easy one, and Revelation is the garbage one, and I just don't think that's an accurate descriptor. So consider this video to be a sort of hybrid review / Revelations propaganda. I'll talk about the aspects of the route that I like, touch upon the areas in which I think it is a failure, and hopefully by the end of it, convince a few of y'all to give the maligned full campaign DLC a second try. That is, if you can actually access it, since Nintendo Online no longer sells access to Fates Revelations, so, maybe this video is pointless. If you haven't purchased Fates Revelations, you can't get it. Unless you promote using an ocean seal. And that does segue us pretty naturally into my first major criticism of Revelation, the way in which it's distributed. Fire Emblem Fates Revelation was basically exclusively a DLC campaign. There were two ways that you could get it. You could either buy the special edition that includes all 3 routes in a single cartridge, which was a limited run and also cost extra since you were purchasing functionally 3 different campaigns. Or you could pay $20 to download it onto your DS if you owned a copy of Conquest or Birthright. If the copy you owned was a cartridge, then this digital version of Revelations would not be playable without the Birthright or Conquest cartridge in the DS. In a vacuum, I don't necessarily hate this, since Revelation is meant to be played after Conquest or Birthright, as the story of the campaign is meant to resolve some of the mysteries that are raised and left unsolved in Birthright and Conquest. However, the words meant to are carrying a lot of weight in that sentence. The truth is that neither Birthright nor Conquest have significant unsolved mysteries beyond who is Anankos, what is he doing, and why is everyone in the world acting super irrationally? And that last question isn't something that's raised by the lore or story, it's raised by the fact that the writing is absolutely awful. While we do learn more about Anankos in Revelation than in any of the other routes, this information isn't really presented as a follow-up to questions that are directly raised in Birthright or Conquest. In fact, I think it's very possible for someone to play through the story of Revelation as their first route and understand it just as well as someone who immersed themselves in both Birthright and Conquest first. There are actually several portions of the story where Revelation goes out of its way to explain in great detail concepts that were also explained in great detail in Conquest and Birthright, such as the Rainbow Sage's prophecy around Yato, or the curse to never talk about Vala. Structurally, there's nothing about the story of Revelation that makes me feel like it should be played after the other routes. But the other routes absolutely feel like they were meant to be played before Revelation, and not for story reasons, but for emotional manipulation. You see, whether you go Conquest or Birthright, there are several characters who inevitably die for reasons outside of your control. If you are a fan of Elise being alive, then going Birthright is not in your best interest. On the other hand, if Takumi is your bestie, then going Conquest will probably leave you heartbroken. The endings of both of these routes have extended sections where Corrin thinks about the people who died and wonders if there was another choice that he or she could have made in order to prevent the deaths. Then Azura dissolves into the ether and cries out, "Buy the DLC to save my life!" It's really manipulative and I freaking hate it. And honestly, if that is enough to turn you off of the route on principle, I can't disagree. Personally, I use promoted Ross to get around this issue, but to each their own. But if you are willing to play this secret third route, then there is still quite a bit of fun to be had. A lot of which comes from that classic Fates good stuff. What I mean by Fates good stuff are the aspects that are present in all 3 Fates games regardless of which route you choose. Unit customizability through class swapping, marriage, and inheritance. And with it, the rewards for long-term planning that come from knowing what you want your final build to look like. The ability to make use of interesting tools, such as knives, dual weapons, spirits, guard naginata, and other weapons with unique attributes. And, of course, most crucially, Fates' pair-up system, which is regarded by many as the best or one of the best mechanics ever to be introduced in Fire Emblem. The balance between guard gauge and backup attacks, as well as factoring in your enemy's ability to utilize both as well, makes for some very interesting tactical situations, and is instrumental in overcoming some of the game's toughest challenges, especially if you are using a suboptimal team. When combined with systems like cooking, tonics, supports, captures, etc., the Fates games just end up being some of the deepest from a gameplay perspective. But of course, everything I've described so far is also present in Conquest and Birthright. So you might be asking, why would I bother going to Rev for these when I can just do the other two routes? Well, first off, I would say that variety is the spice of life. I'm a huge fan of the rescue drop mechanics, but I vary my playthroughs between FE6, FE8, and the Tellius games because I think hammering away at the same campaign over and over again would just get stale. Likewise, if I'm in the mood for the Fates pair-up system, I will alternate between playing Conquest and Revelations depending on what else I'm in the mood for. But, of course, core mechanics on their own are not enough to save a game that has other problems. As you'll notice, I omitted Birthright and FE7 from both of those lists, and that's because I don't really like either of those games. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the three branches of Fate have to offer beyond just the core Fates mechanics. I'll start with Birthright for no other reason than it being at the top of the Branch of Fates menu. Birthright is the easiest of the three games, which I don't consider to be inherently a downside. However, the ways in which it is easy are supremely unfun to me. It has many featureless or nearly featureless maps, consisting of a large number of relatively weak enemies, who are often best dealt with by just advancing a Juggernaut and pressing end turn. For me, this is not the type of gameplay I come to the Fire Emblem series for. However, that's not to say that it offers nothing to fans of the game. Using one of the go-to carries such as Saizo or Ryoma can be an immense power fantasy. And, considering the lower difficulty, if you want to use someone more off-meta, there's plenty of room to play around. While Revelations is often referred to as a sandbox due to containing both Nourian and Hoshiden classes and units, I tend to think that Birthright is much closer to a sandbox game. Sure, there are fewer classes and pairings available excluding Corrin's talent, but even Lunatic mode is easy enough that you can go off-meta with relatively little pushback. For me, this lack of pushback is a deal breaker, but I am not everyone, and sometimes you just want to play around in a sandbox. There's nothing wrong with that. Conquest, on the other hand, provides a lot of pushback against the player. It is often considered both the hardest and the best of the trilogy, and I definitely like it best, but I think it and Revelations are on a similar difficulty level, albeit they have different approaches to difficulty. For the most part, Conquest has incredibly tightly designed maps, although there are definitely a few stinkers in there, in particular when it comes to Generation 2 paralogs. It also offers difficulty in interesting ways, often opting to make enemies threatening using skills rather than pure stats, and frequently rewarding or punishing the player for their resource management outside of the maps. Many of its maps could accurately be described as gimmick maps, and I honestly find quite a few of the gimmicks enjoyable, such as Hinoka's movement swapping or Fuga's wind riding. But between the map gimmicks and the ever-changing layout of skills, playing even a single map of Conquest is a lot of mental overhead. And this overhead goes up when you factor in long-term things, such as managing support, class dipping for skills, etc, etc. Conquest is a great game when I am in the mood for it. When I'm not, it becomes nearly impossible to play, even on the lower difficulties. In some ways, Revelation takes the middle path between these two games, which is pretty fitting. It focuses on gimmick maps, which add extra complexity to the game like Conquest does. It also has a higher difficulty level. However, unlike Conquest, most of its enemies do not have any skills, and the ones that do tend to stick to skills from their class line, such as Lunge on Wyverns or Poison Strike on Ninjas. In this way, its enemy design is closer to that of Birthright. However, the enemy stats tend to be cranked to 11, making juggernauting a much less viable strategy in Revelations than it is in Birthright. The combination of more vanilla enemies with fairly interesting gimmick maps means that Revelations does make me think about positioning and strategy as well as engaging with the gimmick of the map appropriately, but it doesn't mentally overload me by keeping track of 5 different skills on every generic enemy. Yes, that's an exaggeration, but you get the idea. Now, gimmick is a bit of a dirty word, but I don't think it is inherently bad. There are quite a few gimmick maps that I actually find enjoyable because of their gimmicks specifically, such as Conquest Chapter 10, which has the gimmick of the water lowering halfway through. And in fact, I find many of the Revelations maps very good specifically because of their gimmick, such as Chapter 12, which features your army defending several separated boats, or Chapter 19, which includes dragon veins that create replicas of all of the units you have fielded. These maps can lead to some quite interesting gameplay decisions and allow for very unique lines of play. For example, the gimmick of Chapter 20 involves using dragon veins to move bridges back and forth. The most surface level application of this gimmick is to create and remove paths so you can take on enemy groups separately from each other. However, since moving bridges will displace units currently standing on the bridges, as well as flyers flying over the bridge's destination, you can use the dragon veins to push your units forward, teleporting them while you're teleporting the bridges. On the previously mentioned Chapter 19, you can take advantage of equipping weapons or healing replicas in order to manipulate combat on one stage or the other, since the replicas in the originals are separated from each other by an uncrossable chasm. Moving obstacles around in Chapter 13 or activating firewalls in Chapter 16 can allow you to funnel enemies into the areas you want them to be. And I'll even defend the stealth mechanics of Chapter 24. Well, to an extent. I do think it is a legitimate flaw that you can't see where the enemy's patrol path is going to be next turn, but aside from that admittedly major issue, I do find dodging the patrol in order to get the extra pair of boots to be a rewarding and engaging experience, and something that is a break from the general Fire Emblem gameplay. But there's a reason that I've been cherry-picking good gimmick maps instead of just going through the entire campaign in order. And that is that there are definitely some stinkers in the bunch as well. I think the number of bad gimmick maps gets exaggerated, but the degree most certainly does not. When Revelation has bad maps, it has some of the worst maps in the franchise. The two that most readily come to mind are Chapter 10, the snow shoveling map, and Chapter 25, the second elevator map. These are uniquely awful maps that honestly probably deserve full videos breaking down their issues. I do also want to give anti-shoutouts to Chapter 18, which is a annoying scavenger hunt to hit 8 different dragon veins, and Chapter 7, which is a annoying pick-a-path puzzle where if you pick the wrong path, you just get teleported backwards. The solution is always to go towards where there are plants, but it's not immediately obvious at first glance, and even once you know the solution, it just becomes a tedious slog moving your small army forward through a bunch of one-tile-wide tunnels. The fact that Chapter 7 and Chapter 10 are so close to the route's beginning also doesn't do its reputation any favors. That being said, while these are uniquely bad maps by quality, I don't actually think they're bad in terms of quantity. Every Fire Emblem game, yes, even the one that you're thinking of, has a few bad maps in it. Even when it comes to ROM hacks, which are typically higher quality than the mainline games, there tend to be 1 or 2 maps that just stand out as stinkers. I won't defend Snow Shoveling or Elevator Number 2. They are very bad maps, in a way that only Battle Before Dawn, One Survives, and similar stinkers even approach. The lows of Revelations are very low, and honestly, if that turns you off of the game, that's fair. But for me, the highs are worth it, because there are some genuinely fun maps in Vala. The last point that I want to touch on is Rev's cast, because it is often criticized as being extremely unbalanced, and this is true. But my argument is that this isn't a bad thing. Almost every Fire Emblem game has an unbalanced cast. Milady and Sophia join one map apart from each other, which isn't that different from Nyx vs. Shura. So while you will definitely have a harder time playing through Revelations, not using Xander, Ryoma, Leo, etc., it is still very much something you can accomplish even on the highest difficulty. I mean, heck, I was able to drag one of the worst teams imaginable over the finish line during my sabotage run. Laszlo and Perry aren't as effective as Kaze and Korin, but Oscar and Kieran are leagues better than Braum and Gotri, and that doesn't mean that Path of Radiance is a bad game. Although my rival would have you believe otherwise. Which I guess smoothly transitions into the fact that all Fire Emblem games have some manner of flaw. Path of Radiance has tedious animations and unthreatening enemy spam. Fire Emblem 7 has worse map design on average than Revelations. 3 Houses and Engage have base systems that get increasingly tedious the more you replay them. And Radiant Dawn has 23 whole chapters where you aren't able to use Braum, which is honestly the most unforgivable flaw on this list. So, next time you're thinking about what game you'll use to try to become Sail, consider giving Fire Emblem Fates Revelation another shot. And name your avatar Braum, because Braum is our Lord and Savior. This is the year of Braum. Stay Braum, Braumers. Before we go, I do also want to give thanks to a couple of non-Braum individuals. First off, you might have noticed that this is not the only Revelations review to go live today. Akarasu and I planned a simultaneous release of our Rev videos, so go ahead and check his out if you haven't already. It will be linked below. Hopefully, we can abuse the Fates attack stance mechanics in order to deal double damage to all of the Rev haters. Yes, I'm aware that it would be closer to 1.5 times, but I'm going to distract you with a patron plug. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, which includes Gameboo, Fyrant, Cordelia Frey, Smaz Ruby, Jamie Collins, Marin Karen, Thick Molder, George Grenville the 7th PM, Danielle Klaskus, Jagan is a Nest, Tailored Muffin, Herc, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Alt Aegis, Jeff, Autumn Kelsey, and TB. Your support makes these videos possible, and I appreciate it now more than ever since I am taking care of my wife post-surgery. If you are interested in joining the Patreon, there is a link below, although bear in mind that these credits won't be updated for a few weeks since I'm still going to be out of town. There's lots of benefits like polls, early videos, and a couple of things too spicy to talk about on YouTube. But please, only do so if you're financially capable of paying for it. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem videos. Regardless, I hope all of y'all have a wonderful day. Take care, gamers.